It's still dark, and the city is already awake. From a high window you can hear it before you can see it, the rumble of cart wheels on stone, 1,000 doors creaking open, a baker's fire crackling, someone shouting a name down in the street. By the time the sun comes up, 1 million people will be moving through these streets at once. 1 million, no city on earth had ever held that many people before, and not one of them had a clock, an engine, or a single page of news. So how did a Roman actually get through an ordinary day? What did the morning smell like? Where did you go? Who did you see? And what was it really like to live inside the biggest city the world had ever built? This is the story of a single day in ancient Rome, from the first gray light to the last oil lamp, how we got here. Picture the city around 1800 years ago at the height of its power. Rome sits on its famous 7 hills, wrapped around a muddy river called the Tiber. It is loud, crowded, and absolutely enormous, somewhere close to 1 million people packed into a space you could walk across in an afternoon. And almost none of them live the way you might imagine. Forget marble palaces. Most Romans live in towering apartment blocks called insulae, islands, stacked 5 or 6 stories high, leaning over narrow streets so tightly that neighbors could shake hands across the gap. The rich have private houses with gardens and fountains. Everyone else has a rented room, no kitchen, no running water, and a long climb up the stairs. So when our Roman wakes at dawn, let's say a regular citizen, neither rich nor poor, he wakes with the whole shouting, steaming, magnificent machine of the city already running around him. Let's follow him through it, hour by hour, and find out what daily life in Rome was really like. Romans got up early, as soon as it was light, because lamplight was expensive and the day was short. Breakfast was almost nothing, a bit of bread, maybe dipped in wine or olive oil, eaten standing up. Romans saved their real eating for the evening. And then, for a huge number of Romans, the day began with a curious ritual called the salutatio, the morning greeting. Roman society ran on a web of favors. A powerful man, a patron, had a crowd of ordinary citizens who depended on him, called clients. Each morning the clients would put on their best clothes and walk to their patron's house to greet him, wish him well, and ask for help, a loan, a legal favor, a word in the right ear. In return, the patron might hand out a small basket of food or a few coins. So at first light, the streets fill with people walking the same direction, toward the houses of the powerful. Imagine the scene, dozens of men in togas crowded into an entrance hall, waiting their turn to say good morning to one important man. It sounds strange to us, but this was the handshake that held Roman society together, a daily trade of loyalty for protection, running quietly under everything else. Step out into the street, and the city hits all your senses at once. First, the noise. The Roman streets were so loud that one famous writer complained he could never sleep. Iron-rimmed wheels banged over paving stones. Hawkers shouted their prices. Schoolchildren chanted their lessons through open windows. And here's a strange detail. Wheeled carts were actually banned from the city center during daylight hours because the streets were too crowded to move. So all the heavy delivery wagons rolled in at night, which meant the city roared around the clock. Then the crowds. With 1 million people and narrow streets, you didn't so much walk as get carried along by the flow. You'd dodge porters bent under sacks, slaves carrying their masters in covered chairs, and puddles of things you'd rather not name, because the upper floors of those apartment blocks had no plumbing, and not everyone carried their waste down to the street. And then the smell, wood smoke, fresh bread, roasting meat, drains, animals, and the sweat of 1 million bodies, all mixed together in the warm air. Rome was glorious. Rome was also, to be honest, a bit of a mess. Both things were true at once. Now here is one of the quiet miracles that made the whole city possible: water. 1 million people need to drink, wash, and cook every single day. And Rome had no river clean enough to rely on. So the Romans did something astonishing. They went out into the hills, sometimes 50 or 60 miles away, found fresh mountain springs, and built stone channels to carry that water all the way back to the city, flowing gently downhill the entire distance. These were the aqueducts, and they are one of the great engineering feats of the ancient world. Where the land dipped, the Romans raised the channel on those famous rows of arches striding across the countryside. By the height of the empire, around a dozen aqueducts poured water into Rome day and night. enough to supply public fountains on nearly every corner, vast public baths, and even flushing public toilets. Most ordinary Romans didn't have a tap at home. Instead, they walked to the nearest street fountain, which ran constantly and carried water back up all those stairs. But the water was there, free and clean and endless, because engineers 100 years before them had bent the landscape to deliver it. That is what an empire's wealth could buy, a river summoned across the hills just so a city could drink. Follow the crowds long enough and you reach the center of the Roman world, the Forum. The Forum was a long open square ringed with temples, law courts, and grand public buildings, their columns bright with paint and sometimes gold. This was where Rome did its business, all of it. Merchants struck deals. Lawyers argued cases in the open air. Politicians gave speeches from the platform. Friends met to gossip, and everyone came to see and be seen. If you wanted to know what was happening in the world, you came here and listened. And when hunger struck, a Roman didn't go home to cook. Remember, most had no kitchen. Instead, they stopped at a thermopolium, the Roman version of fast food. These were counters open to the street, with big clay jars set into the stone, holding hot stews, sausages, chickpeas, bread, cheese, olives, and cups of watered wine. You'd lean on the counter, eat a quick lunch standing up, and get back to your day. Archaeologists have dug up these snack bars by the hundred, some with the menu still painted on the wall. The Roman lunch rush would feel oddly familiar to you. By early afternoon, the real work of the day was winding down, and it was time for the thing Romans loved best of all, the baths. The public baths, or thermae, were the beating social heart of Rome, and almost everyone went, rich and poor alike, for just a small coin. But calling them baths barely covers it. A great Roman bath complex was more like a whole day out under one roof. You'd move through a series of rooms, a warm room to relax, a hot, steamy room like a sauna, and a shock of cold plunge at the end. The water and the floors were heated by an ingenious system called the hypocaust. The whole building sat on little brick pillars, and hot air from furnaces flowed underneath, warming the stone from below. Underfloor heating 2,000 years ago. But people didn't come just to get clean. The baths had exercise yards, gardens, libraries, food stalls, and space simply to sit and talk. This is where Romans met their friends, made deals, swapped news, and spent the lazy hours of the afternoon. If the Forum was the city's brain, the baths were its living room, the place a million strangers turned for a few hours into neighbors. And then there were the great spectacle days, the days the whole city came to a stop. On these days, Rome gathered at two enormous arenas. At the Circus Maximus, 250,000 people, the largest crowd in the ancient world, packed the stands to watch chariot races, roaring for their favorite teams the way fans roar for football clubs today. People wore their team's colors, argued about their favorite drivers, and bet on the outcome. The thunder of the chariots and the noise of that crowd must have been overwhelming. And at the Colosseum, that vast stone oval that still stands today, Romans watched the games, contests of skill and danger between trained fighters called gladiators, along with grand processions, mock hunts, and elaborate staged shows. The Roman games could be harsh by our standards, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. But to understand Rome, you have to understand this. The emperors put on these spectacles, often for free, to keep 1 million restless people fed and entertained and loyal. A Roman poet summed up the whole strategy in 2 words: bread and circuses. Give the people food and a show, and the city stays calm. It was politics, dressed up as a party. As the lights softened, the city changed again. The shops pulled their shutters. The fountains kept running in the dusk, and Romans went home for the one meal that really mattered, the cena, the evening dinner. For poorer family, that might be a simple bowl of porridge or stew up in the apartment. But for those who could afford it, dinner was the high point of the day, a long, leisurely affair, eaten lying down on couches around a low table, stretching late into the evening. Guests reclined on one elbow while servants brought dish after dish, eggs and olives, fish and roast meats, honeyed fruits and pastries, all washed down with wine mixed with water. Dinner was for talking, for poetry, for laughter, the part of the day that was purely, warmly human. And then, as the last courses were cleared, the oil lamps were lit, and the city outside went dark and dangerous, because Rome had no streetlights and no police force on patrol. Most Romans simply stayed in after sunset, but somewhere out in that darkness, The heavy delivery carts were already rolling back in through the gates, and the whole vast machine was quietly resetting itself for tomorrow. So what was a day in ancient Rome really like? It was loud, crowded, smelly, and dazzling all at once. It was a million people living almost on top of each other, fed by rivers carried across the hills, entertained by emperors, washed in heated marble halls, and crammed into apartment blocks barely held together. It was the first time in human history that so many strangers had ever tried to live together in one place, and somehow, day after day, it worked. And that's how we got the city as we know it. Almost everything about Rome's daily life echoes down to us. The apartment block, the fast food counter, the running water, the public games, the morning rush, the after-work crowd unwinding together. Rome was the first great experiment in packing a million human lives into a single, roaring, ordinary day, and then doing it all again the next morning. The strange thing is that the people in our story didn't think any of it was remarkable. The aqueducts, the crowds, the baths, the million neighbors, to them it was just another day. We look back and call it the ancient world. They just called it home. And maybe 1,000 years from now, someone will look at an ordinary day in your life and wonder what it was like to be alive, right now, in a city of strangers that somehow worked. If you ever wondered how we got here, you're in the right place. See you in the next one.